episode of Recovery TV Live, we are going to talk about what it means to live in a pornified culture. So that's coming up, so stay with us. Greetings, everybody. I'm Josh Nichols. This is my colleague, Carrie Kiger. We are your co-hosts of Recovery TV Live. And so today, Carrie, we're going to talk about this idea of what it means to live in a pornified culture. So before we begin, though, I just want to remind everybody that this is a public forum. So Facebook Live is a public forum, and we do want to welcome your questions and comments in the discussion section, but if you want to keep those anonymous, you are more than welcome to email Valerie, who is standing by her email, and you can submit those questions to that email you see on your screen anonymously, and we'll do our best to filter through those as we go throughout this episode. We also want to remind everybody that Recovery TV is our YouTube channel, so you can see the link to that on your screen, so please check that out and check out some of our other videos. And also the rebroadcast of this will be up there too shortly. So we have episode 1 already up, and you can go watch that one if you wish to. If you happen to be watching the rebroadcast version on YouTube, please check us out on Facebook, like our Facebook channel, and join in with us on these discussions live if that's what you wish to do. And so, Carrie, as we talked about today, we're going to talk about this idea of what it means to live in a pornified culture. And as you can see there, here's a quote that I just put on screen. I took it off, but I'll put it back up there. That says, might be hard for our audience to read there, that this is from the book, The Impact of Pornography by Cordelia Anderson, where she says that I would argue that we live in a pornified culture, and our current sexual climate is, in fact, a sexually toxic environment, one in which many harmful sexual activities and attitudes are made to appear appealing, arousing, and culturally accepted. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute. There we go. So, but before we dive into that, one thing that we wanted to be clear with everybody on is that this episode of Living in a Pornified Culture is not an episode about taking a social justice stance against pornography or on pornography.
Right. This is also not us taking a morality position around pornography or sexuality. This is us really wanting to just talk about it in the way that we see our clients bringing it to us, right? And how we see it impacting mostly relationships, but individuals in the context of individual therapy. But we definitely want to just be clear that that's not our area of expertise, right?
Right. So, I don't mind saying that Carrie and I both have positions on this on a personal level, but that's not what this episode is about, is imposing our position on anybody. We want to really talk about what is being seen nationwide, worldwide in some ways, what we're seeing amongst our clients, and the impact that pornography and the porn industry is having on our culture at large, all the way down to the individual and the couple relationship.
Right. Really, we're talking about the sexualization of relationships and how we've seen that impact the people that we serve, but also making sure that we're talking about it from a healthy sexuality position.
Exactly. And so we're going to cover a few different things today, so I'll show these to you. The first thing we're going to do is really to make an effort at defining porn. You'll understand what I mean by that as we get into that. And then talk a little bit about porn addiction. That's probably something that most of our viewers are familiar with, at least familiar with the terminology of porn addiction, and a lot of people believe that exists and is possible. And then we'll dive into the relational impact, and here we're going to discuss some things that maybe you haven't heard before or maybe you haven't thought of before, and we hope that'll be really interesting. And then as we close out with early exposure, we'll explain to you what that means as we get down to that point.
Right.
So to begin with, let's start with this question of what exactly is pornography. So
Right.
Let's start there.
Okay.
What
Right.
is-
Start broad, right?
Right.
Well, pornography is probably, when you start breaking it down, actually a very individual perspective of what makes something pornographic.
Right. And so when I'm talking with my clients about it, there's a lot of ambiguity built into it, and a lot of spouses are hurt when they discover that their spouse or their partner has been engaging in that, especially in secret. But it's really, they're confused by it, I think, because it's different from infidelity in terms of when someone cheats on their spouse with a physical person than looking at pornography. So there's still a wound there. They know that, but I think intuitively they know that it is a different kind of wound, and it's really kind of hard to identify why it hurts so bad.
Right. And I think what we're introducing is maybe we need to start first with what do you define as pornographic, and then we can talk about how do you feel and what are your values around that.
Right. So let's just take a look at what Rob Weiss and Jennifer Schneider say. Of course, I put the wrong clip up there for you, so here we go. In the book, Always Turned On, Rob Weiss and Jennifer Schneider wrote this book. It's a great book that addresses sex addiction in the digital age. And so he says, in short, pornography is now ubiquitous, accessed anytime, anywhere, and content ranging from seemingly benign, traditional pinup type photos to graphic videos depicting extreme sexual violence, degradation, and more. And then he goes on to talk about, Carrie, about how porn is still very much a thriving industry as the brick and mortar part of the industry is going to the wayside.
Right.
It's still alive and well through technology.
Right. And not just alive and well, but growing.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that might have been an improper
Right,
terminology there, alive and well, but yeah,
Right.
definitely a growing, and I would say probably from their standpoint, a thriving industry. And it's a beast. It's very big and it's very powerful.
Right. Right. And it's as technology continues to grow and develop, so do we see the sex industry growing and developing.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're seeing it everywhere, and I think that's what makes pornography the question of what is pornography so ambiguous. And it is an important question that I think we need to define, or individuals need to define for themselves. But you're driving down the road and you're seeing half-naked people on billboards, or you're watching a commercial, and sex is used very much to sell in that way. And definitely, that's it's eye-catching. People are getting dopamine kicks. I mean, is that pornography? Is certain television shows that we're watching, does that represent pornography? Is
provocative pornography?
Right.
Right? Can pornography exist without being provocative? All those kind of questions.
Yeah. Is pornography anything that's just sexually stimulating that you see with your eyes? I mean, or I've heard of the term mommy porn associated with novels. When the Magic Mike movie came out several years ago, and of course that they get a little more gender specific with that because they identify that with more women are engaging in that. So it's not necessarily a term I would choose, but really what I'm focusing on here is that there are certain mainstream movies that certain people might consider pornographic, or they're reading material that is considered pornographic.
Right. And I think it really kind of comes down to what we wanted to show next, which was it's hard to define. Even the Supreme Court struggled, to give a clear definition.
Yes, and so this is what Carrie's talking about, as you see on your screen. Supreme Court Justice Stuart Potter. Potter Stewart. This is a quote that we've heard many times over. That I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And I think that's kind of been the working definition for most people.
I think so too. Right. And I think that we have the unique opportunity as therapists to actually lead that. So what do you see discussion in our offices with our clients?
Right. And I really do think that, it's okay to use that definition of I know it when I see it, but I think each individual really that needs to answer that question. So I'll put up there the discussion question for this episode is how do you define pornography?
Right.
And you can feel free to share that definition in the discussion of this video. But I do think that's something that everybody really needs to work at figuring out so that they can set the appropriate boundaries for their self and their relationship.
Once you, again, kind of back to once you define it and clarify it, then you can really start processing how do you feel about it. Because if you don't know what it is, you don't really know how you feel. And that ambiguity gets you into trouble in relationships.
Exactly. So if you're watching this and you don't really have a working definition, or you're in a relationship and you and your spouse or partner hasn't really developed a working definition of what pornography is, what is the moral stance you take with that, or your principle, where do your principles and values fit within that? That is a discussion that probably needs to be had.
I would say it's a discussion to have a healthy relationship, right?
Yeah.
To have not just a healthy relationship, but even more specific, healthy sexual relationship.
Exactly. Okay, so let's go to the next part here, and that is not everyone who views porn gets addicted to it, but some do.
Right. And I don't really want to quote numbers about what percentage do or don't, develop a problem with pornography. What we want to really talk about today is those who do develop a problem. That's what we know the most about, because that's what we treat.
Yeah. And, others, I think a lot of people think that, and I might be going out on a limb here, that people who, if you're looking at porn, or people that look at porn, that you're going to get addicted to it. And I would like to make it clear that's not the case, and not everybody who watches it gets addicted to it, but there is a growing number of people that are, and also not just men, because we've often thought of this as a male problem, but a growing number of women as well are also getting addicted to porn. Right,
and I think that there's more women coming out and talking about that too, in a public kind of public way, which is bringing that to, thank goodness, bringing that to the forefront.
Right. And so we're definitely seeing that more and more in our practice as well. It's very rare, especially for generations of the Gen Xers and before that, but even some boomers and above that are experiencing difficulties with pornography. But we're definitely seeing pornography involved in almost every type of sex addiction that's out there. And there are a lot of different types, and we're not going to get into that in this episode, but in the many different types, pornography is usually involved in some way. And it's often a catalyst in some ways.
Well, let's talk about why that is.
Yeah, so one thing we say a lot to our clients is that it's not a heart problem, it's a brain problem, and this is a dilemma for people coming in and they feel terrible about the pain that they've caused, or feel like that they have really hurt someone they love, or if you're religious and you feel like you've let down God. And one thing when I'm talking to ministers about this, I say, please don't tell somebody to get their heart right with God when they come into your office to tell you that they're struggling with this. Their heart is right with God. That's why they're in your office. So it's definitely a brain problem, and so there is some aspects of the brain that we probably need to just address real quickly. And the first one is this idea of neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity is the capacity for the nervous system to develop new neuronal connections. And to put that in even more layman's terms, it's just the idea that the brain is elastic. It's always changing. It's not, you're not born with a brain and it stays the same throughout your life, right? The environment is constantly changing and shifting the way that your brain functions.
So I really like Bill Struthers, or William Struthers, a quote from his book Wired for Intimacy, where he just says, simply stated, that repeated exposure to any stimuli results in neural circuit making. And so what that means is that as you experience something over and over again, you're creating neural pathways in your brain. And when your brain experiences that stimulus in some way, it jumps on that neural pathway, and then the behavior that was trained to come after that ensues. And so now that's sometimes that's not encouraging for the addict to hear, but I think from a therapeutic standpoint, I'd much rather it be a brain problem than a heart problem.
Sure.
And the fact that the brain is elastic, it means that it got wired that way. We can rewire it.
Right. We can change that pathway. Just like you can do that on a real path, you can start walking a different way, and eventually that becomes the new path.
Right. So if you think about it, like if someone was exposed to pornography at a very early age, say, anywhere between 9 to 12 or 13 years old, and they start utilizing that from that age to deal with stress, to deal with problems, it just creates a numbing effect at times. Sometimes it just feels good.
Right.
And that's the pattern for years and years. And then all of a sudden they get into a relationship and they think it's going to stop.
Right.
And then it doesn't. And they're kind of taken back by that. But that's because there's neural pathways in the brain that have been created, and you're getting a flood of dopamine. So let's talk about dopamine a little bit.
Dopamine is that feel-good chemical. It's the chemical that you have experienced after you eat a really good meal, and you sit back and you say, "Oh, that was so good."
Right.
It's something that after you've had a good time and you've enjoyed yourself and you feel good. It happens after sex. That release of feeling pleasure, but also feeling kind of calm at the same time. And our brain, Josh says it like this a lot of the times, our brains are selfish organisms in that they want to feel good. Right. And so once you have experienced dopamine associated with an experience, your brain is going to search out that experience again because it wants the dopamine.
Right. So you also got to think of it too, like that when these neural pathways have been created, that dopamine, being the feel-good chemical, is actually getting flooded through the system. Right. So in much bigger ways than what you would normally get if you were having a healthy sexual experience with a real person.
Right.
There's definitely a body of research out there that's showing that people who are watching moving porn and masturbating to it are getting 4 or 5 and maybe up to 10 times the amount of dopamine that they should be getting, which is equivalent to some drugs that you can use on street drugs that you might use and it's the same chemical, it's dopamine flooding the system. And I kind of say, the way I see it is that pornography kind of became a safer route to get that substance without using a dangerous external substance. Right. So you're accessing the reward center of your brain, the sexual reward center of your brain, to get this flood of dopamine, and I don't have to use marijuana.
Drugs or alcohol.
Right.
And I don't have to take those risks. This is a safe risk.
Right.
Right.
And so just think about that when you're doing that for years and years and years. The brain actually will start withholding dopamine from you until it gets it that way.
Which creates the craving. Right. Yeah. And that makes you want to pursue that even more. That pathway becomes even more entrenched.
Exactly. You see here in William Struther's book, it's called Wired for Intimacy, How Pornography Hijacks the Male Brain. And we often talk to our clients about what we call the hijacked brain. Right. Because because the brain is really powerful, and when you experience certain stimuli and you jump on that neural pathway that's really dug deep, there are times when people that are watching porn or hooked on porn that'll say, I don't want to do this, while they're doing it, but they can't bring themselves to put their phone down, they can't bring themselves to shut their laptop lid, and that's what we call a hijacked brain.
Right, and that's when it's becoming something that looks like addiction. Yeah,
because it's basically beyond your control.
Taken over.
So one thing that we need to talk about is how we treat that. And now that's a really broad scope, but let's talk about the 90-day challenge.
Okay. And so the 90-day challenge is similar to the stance that Alcoholics Anonymous takes for people that are entering recovery from alcohol. They'll say you need to do 90 meetings in 90 days. And so this 90-day challenge around pornography addiction is to abstain from viewing pornography for 90 days, abstain from sexual behavior for 90 days.
Right, and so it's not just a number we came up with.
Right, no, it's not our number.
Right, it's definitely something that research has shown. It's been, like Carrie said, been used by AA for years, and in the sex addiction treatment community,
Right.
we have there's been developed its own way of doing that.
Mhm.
So yeah, so that's something that we work with people on as a first step to help rewire the brain.
Right.
And it's for porn addicts, in particularly from our experience,
Yeah.
it's terribly difficult.
It's very difficult. Most people start the 90-day challenge and have to reset several times.
Right.
That's the most common response. And that's not a failure. That's going to tell you something about the brain wiring, about what makes it so hard and when it happens, what number of days into it. That's actually telling you a lot about the way that the brain is wired and trying to rewire.
Right. And so if you're watching this and you're dealing with a struggle with pornography, or if your spouse or partner's struggling with it, you might talk to your therapist or a recovery specialist
Right.
about this abstinence plan, this what we call the 90-day challenge, as a way to get started in rewiring the brain.
It's a start.
Right. You're not out of the woods
Right.
in 90 days, but it's definitely a lot of people who do complete it feel like they are feeling more in control.
Right.
They're coming back to us and saying, "Hey, I was tempted to look at porn, but this time I said no, I don't want to," and I shut it down instead of continuing to go with it.
Right. Right. It's a good start to start changing your relationship with pornography, but even with your sexuality.
Right. Okay. All right. So that's probably something that you've all have been familiar with at this point in our world, in our culture. So let's talk about something a little more complicated here, and that is porn impacts us all, even if you don't view it. Now that might surprise some of you, and some of you maybe not, but we're going to spend some time talking about what does that mean.
Right. We're going to talk about it again based on what we're seeing a lot of our clients coming in and talking to us about it. And
Right.
A lot of people are talking about it from the sense of, geez, what's expected of me as a sexual person and as a sexual partner.
Right. Yeah. So the porn industry is huge, and there's a good book that called Pornland that you can see there on your screen. One thing I want to say about Pornland is that it's Gail Dines, who wrote that book, is definitely taking a social justice stance. And if you can't stomach foul language and things, she doesn't pull any punches because she uses the language of the porn industry in that book.
Right.
But she definitely will show you in that book just how big the porn industry is, and also how we're all impacted by it, and in some ways even supporting it, and we don't even know it.
Right.
You know, we're a lot of times they're the first ones to create things. Like, for example, if you've ever paid for anything online, with a credit card, the porn industry is the first industry to do that. They created that ability to do that. And there are a lot of other things like that that we don't even know we're engaging in, but they're very big, they're very powerful and influential, and so a lot of people are being impacted by it and they don't even know it. So, I'm going to put this graphic back on your screen because I want to read it to you, where Gail Dine says, "One thing is certain, we are in the midst of a massive social experiment. Only the laboratory here is our world, and the effects will play out on the people who never agreed to participate." And she's talking about us in that, right? So as you were saying, there's this idea of what we call sex expectations, right?
Right. So a lot of the time you'll hear our clients talking to us about that they're having problems in their sex life, they're having problems with their sexuality. And when we start asking them what those problems are and how do they know they're problems, it's because they've internalized on some level that they're supposed to be having the kind of sex that's in pornography. They're supposed to be having sex freely. They're supposed to be having sex for a long time. They're supposed to always be enjoying it. And so because that's not their experience, there must be something wrong with it.
Right. Yeah, for men, you're always supposed to have an erection. For women, you're always supposed to orgasm. And then there are a number of other things. I mean, if you, one thing you could do is, like, if you look through social media and you look at how women pose themselves versus how men pose themselves in pictures, for example. Women, there's this expectation that you're supposed to bend a certain way when you pose, and these in very abnormal poses, really, unrealistic, uncomfortable. We don't stand that way. Men don't have to smile in pictures. Women are supposed to smile. If you're not smiling, then something's wrong. Right? And the reason why I'm bringing those up is because it's those types of behaviors that are influencing everybody, and they're a big part of that's driven by the porn industry.
Right, where everybody's ready to go. Everybody's ready for sex. Everybody's interested in sex. Everybody's enjoying sex all at the same time.
Right.
All the time. There's no problems, right? In pornography and in the fantasy world about sex, no one has a headache.
That's
no
right.
one struggles with erections, right?
They're all friends in the end.
Everything works out great.
Yeah. There's always novelty. There's always excitement. There's never a problem. There's not a learning curve.
No, there's no routine.
Right. And so especially I think in the millennial generation, young girls especially are not watching porn, not observing it, but they think that they're supposed to be doing all these things because that's what their boyfriends or partners are.
Or even friend groups. Talked about.
Yeah. That's what's expected.
Right.
In that sense. And then, of course, we know that men or young men are viewing porn more often than women. So they have those expectations, too, that this is what good sex is. And I'm sure that's driving the sex educators crazy right now. Right. Because it's a terrible depiction of what healthy sexuality looks like.
Healthy and realistic sexual relationships look like.
Right. And so having appropriate sex expectations is really important. And some of the things I'm working with my clients on is that your healthy sexual relationship should not be driven by erection, intercourse, and orgasm.
Right. You can't measure it by those three things.
Right.
Because if so, you're going to come up short all the time. And instead, to focus on the relational aspect, right? But that's harder to do when all of the information kind of surrounding us is about, pleasure and that's what you should be expecting and demanding every time you have a sexual experience.
Exactly. There's so much more involved in what it means to have a healthy sexuality than orgasm, intercourse, and erections. Okay, so let's talk about this next one, body image and obligatory sex.
Right, and that's obviously kind of connected to those expectations. But the idea that a lot of our clients are talking about that they don't really feel so good about the way they look. And if sex sells and sexual images are everywhere, how can you not but evaluate yourself and your body against those images?
Right. And so a lot of the porn industry, everybody's just so beautiful and so put together, and there's not a single flaw in their bodies. And I think that especially men in particularly come to expect that from their spouses, and the spouse and partners, and the partners tend to expect that from themselves.
Sure.
Too. And I think before the porn industry, women, the culture has been very hard on women when it comes to how they're supposed to look.
Right. The value of a woman has often, for a long time, been defined by how aesthetically pleasing the woman is. Sure.
Right. And definitely, the porn industry coming on the scene, especially in the age of the internet, has definitely not helped that cause.
Right. It's exploded it probably.
Right. Yeah. And created very unrealistic expectations, and there are people coming into our office that see the physical attraction piece as absolutely pertinent for a healthy relationship and healthy sex life.
Sure.
Even though they know that they're getting older and they know what happens when the body gets older.
Sure.
But it's I truly believe it's driven by the porn industry.
Sure.
You know? And so now there's also this concept that you see on your screen called obligatory sex.
Obligatory sex is exactly what it says, having sex out of obligation. And the way that I see that struggling being presented to me in my office is that people are engaging in either specific sex acts that they don't really want to do, but they make these assumptions that that's what their partner wants, and so they will oblige in order to be a satisfying sexual partner.
Exactly.
And I also see it happening in that people are just having sex at all with their partner because it's expected of them, and they're having it at a maybe even at a frequency that they think is what they're supposed to be doing.
Right.
But when I start talking with clients about, well, where's your desire, where are your wants, how do you know, it becomes kind of clear that sex is happening often from this position of out of obligation.
Right. And Carrie is also talking about obligatory sex maybe before the discovery of infidelity,
Right.
Because on the other side of infidelity, obligatory sex takes a whole different
Right,
shape,
that's
right?
true,
Because
right.
the spouses are often now wanting to have sex or feel obligated to have sex to help control the addiction.
Right.
So whereas what you're talking about is that the cultural, the influence that porn has had on the culture is that this is just something I thought a good partner is supposed to do.
Right, sure.
But after they find out their spouse or partner has been going elsewhere to be sexually gratified, now they feel compelled to have sex to keep their partner faithful. And that's not a very healthy or appropriate use of sex or sexuality.
Right, it's definitely an uphill battle.
Right. And so, there's a lot of impact, and we're just covering a few things that we're seeing that are standing out that you could be able to relate to. But there's so many more that we could cover.
Right.
But the last one we do want to look at is, in particularly in men, is what's called porn-induced erectile dysfunction. Now, this is actually a real thing. It's found its way into the body of literature.
And who brought it to our attention is not just from our reading, but in our interaction with urologists.
Yeah.
That urologists are saying, gosh, can I have more of your information, because I keep having these young men that were physically healthy enough to be able to achieve and maintain erection are not able to.
Exactly.
And that they're attributing it and talking to their doctors about how pornography is impacting their ability to be physically ready for sex.
Right. So what's happening here is that their brains have been flooded with so much dopamine and getting sexually aroused through this way that they, when you actually have sex, it's a very different experience than watching it on screen. And it's not what they expected, and they're not able to maintain their erection because they're not, the eroticism isn't there, the excitement isn't there, and because they're not being visually stimulated.
Right. In the same way.
In the same way, right. So now I do want it to be clear on something too, that if your man is experiencing this at a young age, 19, 20 years old, does not mean, I don't want you to assume that, oh, he must be watching porn.
Right.
You know, there definitely could be something physical going on.
Absolutely.
So usually our first step in that is to go ahead and send people to their physician to have some blood work ran to make sure it's not a thyroid issue or a testosterone issue.
Or something else.
Or something completely different.
Right. Definitely. And,
it could be anxiety.
It could be anxiety. And whenever you're talking about any of these things that have a clear physical impact, you always want to start with a good physical examination to rule it out, because good, important psychological and relational health still can't make something that's physical, right? We can't treat it that way. We have to treat it properly.
Right. And so this brings us to the last thing that we want to bring up, and that is what about our children? And this is where I think a lot of us, especially those of us that are parents, can really have a lot of anxiety and angst, because it's like, before all we had to do was monitor the TV.
Right.
And then we got to monitor a laptop, and then a cell phone, and then an Xbox, and then the Wii, and it's like, and then they got friends that have all these things, and it's like, when you know that porn is just at their fingertips, it's terrifying as a parent, I think.
It is terrifying, and it is hard to monitor, and it's hard to control. Anybody can be watching pornography anywhere at any time. That's just the reality, and that's never been the case before. from Gen X and Y, pornography was not what it is now.
Right. Yeah, so like when I was a kid, and if we stumbled into porn, we were going to stumble into a Playboy magazine. Of course, it isn't healthy for a young mind to see, but it's much different than stumbling into a porn scene where a young woman is being seemingly raped or ravaged or into other types of genres that are out there.
Violent.
Right. And a lot of people, you could make an argument that your first exposure to porn is traumatic because a lot of people who can remember their first time they saw porn.
And kids have access to it now, which is why this question of what about our children, kids have access to it in a way they never have. And so as parents, you're going to have to change the way that you parent, the way that you acknowledge that this is just part of our reality.
Right. And so we would love to talk about that more, but we are excited to have Diana Giles join us next in 2 weeks on Recovery TV Live, where she actually runs a program called Sensible Cyber Parenting, where this is what she deals with. And so we definitely hope you'll find your way back here in a couple weeks to watch that episode. I'm excited to have her on.
Yes, we are too. It's nice to have an expert.
Yeah. So feel free also, to peruse our website, Family Solutions Counseling, and you can also, on that website, you can find the schedule for upcoming episodes that we have. As you can see on your screen, the dates and what we're going to talk about, as well as some of the guests we're going to have on. And we're really excited about some of these future guests, including Rob Weiss, who has agreed to talk about is technology the devil? So that'll be a fun one to do as well. But that's all we have for you today, and we hope that you found it beneficial and helpful. And feel free, if you didn't comment as you watch this, write some comments in there, or send us a private email, and we'll do our best to answer those. Get back with you.
Yes. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.